Let's introduce our guest. Kevin Mwangi is a program officer at the Independent Medical Legal Unit. Good morning, Kevin.
Good morning.
It's good to have you on the show. Welcome to the hot seat of the Situation Room.
Thank you for having me.
We're talking about forced disappearances and extrajudicial killings and why this is an issue in the country. First of all, let's do some definitions. What is forced disappearance?
So the correct term is enforced disappearance.
Enforced.
Yes.
Okay.
And so there are three areas in which we look at for us to define what enforced disappearances is. One of them is the deprivation of the right to liberty by someone without your consent or without your will. So you have to be deprived of your right to liberty without you willingly giving consent for that. Secondly, it has to be done by government officials and not civilians. And then thirdly, the government has to either deny knowledge of the deprivation of liberty or conceal or deny the knowledge of the whereabouts of where that person is. And enforced disappearances doesn't have to have a time. It can be 5 minutes, it can be 10 years, 50 years. It doesn't have a time limit to it, a time component to it, as long as those three components are attached to it. And then the other thing we need to know that it's permanent. It continues until the person is found. Okay. So it doesn't stop after 2 years. If I'm not found in 100 years, I'm still a victim of enforced disappearance.
Okay. Why does it have to be by government? Because what stops it from being enforced if I go kidnap CT and I lock him in my basement, for example, and I have a weapon? What then characterizes it as enforced because I'm a civilian?
So we're guided by international law, given that Kenya does not have a definition on its own on national legislation. And so the UN guideline that gives us this definition is the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances. And so that's where we derive that definition from. Yes.
I'm asking this because, maybe just kind of like jumping the gun a little bit, but there have been disappearances of individuals who've been held by folks who are posing as law enforcers. They're not government. They're not. They're individuals who may have taken on the persona for a time period, but they are civilians as well. And we've known them to be forced disappearances. We've known those individuals to have been disappeared, as it were.
Yeah.
So then, would they then be classified as something different because they fall into the numbers of folks who've disappeared?
Yes. It's the same thing as extrajudicial killings and, let's say something like murder. Okay, technically they will be charged under murder, but to hold the government to a higher accountability, in layman language, you call them extrajudicial killings. So we don't say a civilian killed you in extrajudicial killings by civilians. We only say by government officials.
Okay.
This definition came in to just ensure that we hold the government to a higher accountability.
Okay.
Is it also because history has given us ample evidence that when it comes to disappearances of large numbers of people, or given the powers that government have, that they have at their behest the means to be able to do precisely this? They can arrest people, they can hold you without, whatever, with reasons best known to them. Is it because of the powers that government has and what history has shown us to be the way in which certain governments have used their powers in subjugating the people? Is this why we hold the government to a higher accountability?
Yes. You'll find that primarily in African countries, you'll find that enforced disappearances happens within the context of political dynamics. So you'll find like there was a massacre in Congo, Republic of Congo, and there was a case even before the African Commission in which it held the Republic of Congo accountable for acts of enforced disappearances. And so, yes, to answer your question, yes. And to also go back to her question, if the government has knowledge, there's what we call acquiescence. I know that someone is trying to abduct you, for example, and then I do nothing about it, I'm party to partisan to that disappearance, for example. And that we can say is a form of enforced disappearance.
Okay.
Or if a government official gives a civilian directive to go and, someone to abduct someone, that can also be a form of enforced disappearance.
Okay.
Yes, it's an act or an omission.
Okay.
Yes.
But at what point then do you say that this is enforced disappearance? When someone has disappeared and you don't know who picked them. So you just know the last time they were seen was at such and such a place. They were en route to Nakuru, for instance, right? They've gone missing. What do you categorize that as? Is it enforced disappearance or is it just disappearance?
It's disappearance.
It's just disappearance.
Because there has to be a component in which the government officials are involved and they have full knowledge of where the whereabouts of these people are. So without those two components, I cannot categorically say that it's enforced disappearances.
Then in that case, Kevin, then you have very few numbers of people that you talk about enforced disappearance. Because even in many cases, you'll talk about somebody who's been arrested by the police and then they haven't been seen since. But if you go to police records, they tell you, we released that person. So, practically and technically speaking, this is not enforced disappearance because the police released the person. It's just that the person was then abducted out there by people unknown to the police and unknown to the family.
Let me say that at IMLU, when we categorize a case of enforced disappearance, it is a case that we have actually established those three cadets of enforced disappearances.
Okay.
So a person is arrested. For example, let me take your case. Is arrested and disappears. He was not booked at the OB number. He was not charged with anything. He got arrested, and we for sure know it's the security officials. They had badges. We have witnesses who saw it, but the person is nowhere to be found. I even have a case of where someone was taken to court. They were charged. They went through the whole cycle. Then they were released on
bail.
On bail. But on being released, and this happened in Nakuru, the security officials took them outside that courtroom, and there were many. Even the magistrate saw it. Yes.
And they've disappeared since then.
They've never been found.
So how many cases are you dealing with currently at IMLU of enforced disappearance?
As of last year, we have only had 2 cases.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, who are those 2?
Like I've said that there were 2 individuals who were abducted on that.
And since then, nothing?
Nothing.
No word to the family?
No.
What do the security agencies say?
They deny it.
Okay. In the case of then extrajudicial killings, this is where we say, let's say somebody has died in police custody, is it?
Yeah.
Or somebody has then been shot by police or died in the hands of the police, Kenjo Koma brothers and such, right? Do we also look at cases where the last time somebody was seen was with police officers and then they turn up somewhere dead at Rivayala, for instance? That's also part of extrajudicial killings.
Yes. Yes. Like I said, you'll find that enforced disappearances, what normally happens, it's a series of human rights violations. So even someone is abducted and then they're tortured, primarily they're found dead.
Okay.
What's the correlation? When you look at, say, these disappearances, there are countries where you report more such disappearances than others. Is there commonality? Is there, for instance, can you typify the sort of governments that in whose control we see such incidences in greater numbers? Or that's question number 1. Question number 2 is there a certain category of citizen in these countries who seems to be targeted more than others?
Yes. You'll find that, let me start with the second question.
Okay.
You'll find that there's this narrative.
The last shall be first in this instance. Yes.
You'll find that there's a narrative that the courts are now not doing their work. And so security officials will say, why do we have to take someone through the court process? They're released on bail, they come back and do the same crime. It becomes a cycle. And so security officials are taking the law into their arms.
Yes.
So first it will be enforced disappearance, then it will lead to extrajudicial killings. That's the cycle we see in our files. Yes. Then secondly, the first question, in countries that have respect for human rights primarily, like every other country, you'll not see, and where the leaders are actually, there's political goodwill for that, you will not see a lot of enforced disappearances. But where there's democracy is not even there, you'll find that enforced disappearance, you rise against the government, you disappear and you're killed, and that's the end of the story. And then you'll find this in the ICC, at the African Commission cases, the cases before them. Yeah.
So what severity are we looking at in Kenya? Is it a problem big enough that some attention needs to be paid? What are we looking at then in terms of numbers? If you talked about enforced disappearances, for example, in the 2 cases that we saw last year, and not talking about extrajudicial killings, we've heard from several groups over time that the numbers, unfortunately, are quite high. The River Yala incident, for example, incidences that have been happening over the last 18 months or so, 67 was the last count of bodies that have been retrieved from that river. And 87% of those seem to have some foul play in terms of what was done to these bodies before death. So then implicating law enforcement at some point, or at least some kind of foul play. So how much of a problem is this in Kenya right now?
Missing Voices, as of last year, had 32 cases. So one life is one too many. And you see, you have no recourse in law. Kenya does not have legislation on enforced disappearance. It has not ratified this international convention. One of the other things I also do is I work at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, where I sit in a group where we develop policies, do missions on enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings in the 55 African countries. And so one life is one too many. We're currently developing guidelines to just ensure that Africa has, a policy on enforced disappearances, because we're realizing this is a problem and it's underreported. People don't even understand what is enforced disappearance. And so once they don't understand that, how do I report a violation that I actually do not even understand? So the numbers could be many, but it's only that we get to hear about the very few cases.
Okay.
And they have no remedy or no recourse. And so that's a problem that needs to be addressed. Because let's say in court, I can only go under habeas corpus, and that's if a person was in custody. Other than that,
If police say we don't have him, that's it.
yes.
And we didn't pick him in the first place. So apart from a lack of then a legal and regulatory framework, what else are the challenges? I mean, because we're looking at it from just going back to what City was saying, there are very many cases where if you look at the chronology of events, this is somebody who has had history and run-ins with the law.
Yeah.
Gone through the process, back out in the streets, back into the process, back out in the streets, and then the next thing you see is they turn up dead. And everything apart from the legal route will tell you that this one was finished off by police officers. Do you at some point sit back and ask the police officers, what challenges are you facing? What is it that you require in terms of even policy or regulation or new legislation that can help you so that you don't have to go through this? Because I'd imagine by the time the police officers are deciding, you know what now, come on, it's become too much. Let's just finish this problem once and for all. They're dealing with something. There's something they're dealing with.
I'd say it's a very multidimensional issue. One is, after the 2007 and 2008 general elections, there was a lot of human rights violations that happened. And there was a task force that was called the Ransley task force that was formed to look into police reforms. And they gave very good recommendations. And one of them was the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution, because at the time, the police were the perpetrators, the prosecutors, and the investigators. And so in such a flawed system, there was no justice was never to be realized. So there needed to be separation of these entities and also create mechanisms in which justice and accountability can be realized. And so one of them was the Office of Director of Public Prosecution. One of the most crucial ones was the National Coroner Service Act that was enacted in 2017, in which it gives an avenue for forensic documentation to be conducted in many of these crime scenes.
Okay.
I'll give you an example of, there's a lady who died in 2018 who was hacked in Eldoret. And we all saw that the police officer went and took the murder weapon with their own bare hands, which means they tampered with evidence, which means the credibility of that evidence probably will never see And so the work of the coroner is to come. We have all seen CSI or the investigative series. We always have a coroner in that, where they come to the body, they collect the forensic evidence, they work with the police officers and the investigators until the very end. And so that has not been set up. So as of right now, a person dies, the way the forensic evidence is collected is not to the standards that would ensure that this, even if I take this court file to court, it's bulletproof, that we have worked with professionals throughout this journey and we have a case. And so that's some of the issues that
Why
we have.
has this law not been operationalized? I mean, it was passed, like you said, it was assented to by the president in 2017. Up to date, the Office of the National Coroner has not been established. Why?
I'd say lack of political goodwill. But Kenya has this habit of passing very many laws and then just shelving them. But I'd say lack of political goodwill would be my
Has there been push by organizations such as yours?
Yes.
And what feedback do you get?
They tell us it's a funding issue. But they are the ones who create the budgets. So if you want to create this office, you have to set aside. I can set aside money to create this office. They have to be the ones to set aside money to create this office.
Okay.
And sorry, go ahead and do.
In relation to this, just recently, this high-class, world-class expert lab was established, the DCI. Took some 30-odd years to, finish, but that has come about. Would you say, in the work that's being done, does that give any kind of impetus or any kind of encouragement to the work that we are hoping would be done when concerns extrajudicial killings in the country? Because one of the things that you've talked about is evidence pointing to who or whom would have perpetrated here or there. So now finally there's this facility that is up. And then one of the questions that came about was that, is it going to be properly manned and staffed by folks and the right equipment that is needed? Does that give any kind of encouragement to this process that we've been hoping would play out to find these individuals whose lives would have been lost at the hands of whomever?
No.
Oh, okay.
Because who's conducting the extrajudicial killings? So let me give you an example. IPOA, the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, does not have a forensic lab. So if they need a bullet analyzed to tell you which bullet this gun came from, they have to send it to the DCI. The DCI is part of the security forces. Could be a DCI person who conducted this. So there's supposed to be an Independent Policing Oversight Authority overseeing.
But they still have to take it to the folks that they're overseeing.
Exactly. Okay. So that's the same thing the issue I have with the lab. If they have to still go back and investigate themselves, basically, which is what we are saying, then it doesn't solve the issue of extrajudicial killings. IPOA should have their own lab to do their own forensics, and they have a department that's
You're supposed to do that.
Yes.
If indeed the coroner's offices were set, according to what the government had proposed, were they supposed to be in all the counties? Were they supposed to be in regions? How were they supposed to be set up?
Yes, so there's supposed to be a coroner general who will oversee it and will be based in Nairobi. Then each county will have the coroners. So it was supposed to be decentralized to each of the counties. And it's an independent body. So that's where also the accountability comes into play. It's supposed to be an independent body.
Do we have clarity as to where the funding was supposed to come from or to which ministry they were supposed to be nestled in?
It was supposed to be under the Ministry of Justice. So, which is not, under the current regime, has not been established.
There's no Ministry
Yes.
of Justice.
And
The matter was actually, I think, in court where the AG said, well, it's Minister for Justice. I am not.
I'm not the one.
Ask the president. I am not here to suffer.
So that has been the quagmire in all this.
So who answers for them?
The-
Who answers for these? I mean, and I
For
think that
failure
is
to
where we are
implement.
right now. Who answers for failure to implement? Who answers for the lack of solutions or lack of closure for these lives that have been lost? 32 cases, 67 here, odd 89 here. Amnesty gives their own numbers. IMLU gives numbers. You know, we're looking at lives lost in the hundreds of thousands. In the hundreds, right? With no explanation. Who answers?
I'd say IPOA has been doing a great job. We have actually seen 8 convictions on extrajudicial killings over the last 10 years of their 12 years. 11 years of their existence.
Okay, between 10 and 12.
Yes.
Okay.
Of their existence.
Yeah.
And I think that entity was formed to ensure that there is accountability
Right.
for these heinous crimes, but then accountability only for the National Police Service. You realize that from our case files, we are now seeing the Kenya Wild Service, the Kenya Forest Service, who don't have an oversight mechanism over them. And so it's now making us go back to questioning, how do we now ensure that all the security ambits have an oversight mechanism over them? Yes.
Let's
But
take
at
a
the
break.
end of the day, it boils down to the government.
All of them are nestled under some ministry. So obviously, even if it's the Kenya Wildlife Service, there is the Ministry of Tourism and Wildlife. If it's a forestry, there's a Ministry of Environment. There's a minister in charge who's the policy and everything head of that. Anyway, let's take this quick break. 28 minutes to 8, Kenya's biggest conversation. Kevin Mwangi is a program officer at the Independent Medical Legal Unit, IMLU. We are talking about enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings, the states of these two in the country and what needs to be done so we can address this. Let's take this break, take a look at the traffic and weather. We'll be back shortly. Good morning. We are talking about enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings in the country and how we are doing. Kevin, I want to come back to that issue of what we often accuse the police officers of doing, and this is extrajudicial killings. Do you at some point sit back, even you as Kevin individually, and see there's some justification to this? Or there's a reason why I can understand where the police officers are coming from?
I can say there's no justification to it, but we have been doing research just to see what could be the issue, because police reforms has been happening since the 90s, and we're not seeing much change. And so one of the things we have been trying is to see whether they can get psychological support, because they work in a very, what can I put it? In a very
Tough.
Yes, and they need the support that they can get. And so that's some of the issues I've been doing. So IMLU works in 2 ways. It works on response and prevention. So we have been working on police reforms, advocating for them to be given better welfare, the welfare of the police officers. This includes their housing as well, et cetera, yeah.
Paint a picture of how that would then result, because you talk about performance and result, right?
Yeah.
How would that then result? How would better welfare of police, for example, result in fewer numbers, for example, of extrajudicial killings?
You see, when you look at the psychological support, some of them are maybe suffering from a mental, let's say PTSD. And when they're there in the field, they're maybe reacting to not primarily the situation, they're reacting to their own personal. We have seen even them killing their spouses as well,
Killing each other.
killing each other. So it's gone beyond that, and it's becoming a situation that has to be contained. Yes.
What would be some noticeable elements, noted and noticeable elements in these police reforms? Take a 10-year block, for example. What are some distinct things that you could say? Because you said, look, we can't necessarily stop the killing, but we can reform. And one of the things that we've been harping on is the reform of the police service, for example. So what are some noted and noticeable things that you can see have changed or gotten better just the last 10 years? Within the police force that we can say, this one has improved, so we can see better outcomes?
I can say one of them is that there's a better relationship between them and the community in some areas, with what we're calling the community policing, because they don't work in isolation. My neighbor knows more about what I am doing than the police officer at the police station, and is able to, in case I'm engaging in a crime, alert them. So there's collaboration between, unlike previously where it was us versus them, which is where the culture of the antagonistic relationship between the police officers and the community has come from.
Okay.
So I'd say that is a very remarkable one. There's also collaboration that has been happening with the police as well, between civil society and the police, in where maybe they see they have capacity gaps, for example, and they need training on some issues. They're able to reach out to us, and we're able to train them, and there's some change. There are good elements within the National Police Service. Not all of them are bad. Most of them are good, but we have some elements in there as well.
Okay.
And as even we go to the election, we have seen a lot of preparedness this time around from the National Police Service.
Let me ask this question, Kevin, if I may. In your research, have you looked at countries where, for instance, the welfare of police officers are well looked after, meaning there's a consistency in it and there are certain assurances in terms of, say, the housing, in terms of social welfare, in terms of just...
Pay.
Yes. Do we find that in such countries, if they exist, that you have a reduced to a non-existent situation where you have extrajudicial killing, as opposed to one where the police force do not have these benefits?
I'd say it helps, but it doesn't make it a non-issue.
Yes.
Like in the US, we still see it as well.
We do.
So it's also a culture that is there. I'll give you an example of Kiganjo has a very benign human rights component when they're being trained.
There's a unit
There's a unit.
for human rights.
But when you get outside the police, after Kiganjo, you're told your human rights imeishia hapo. Kwingine ni story ingine. So there's also the issue of culture within the system, which has to be. It's like corruption. You know, we have accepted corruption as
Part of life.
part of
Part of our
life.
culture.
So human rights also, it's slowly getting into the National Police Service. It's a work in progress. There needs to be a culture shift as well.
Are there some reforms or support that is required on the system of justice itself? Because, yes, I hear what you say, that there are police officers who are coming to work with PTSD, they're dealing with other issues, and so their fingers are light on the trigger, and they'll end up shooting somebody and injuring them, maiming them, or killing them. There are other cases where police officers are basically dealing with the same criminal over and over again, and they're like, look, I've got to end this, because every day a criminal is out there is not the same way as every day somebody else is out there. When a criminal is out there, that's a danger to the police officer and a danger to community, to the society. Say, for example, when we see on social media, Hesiwa Dandora, it's said that it's run by these people who have knowledge of the workings of the police. Young, known criminals in the community, they are known, and everybody in the community knows that this so-and-so is a criminal. And the message is sent out there, look, so-and-so, you've been arrested, you've been taken to court, you're out on bail, you went in, you were incarcerated for a year, you came out, you're back into these ways. Come on, change your ways, or we'll give you 3 months. You can see where the cops are coming from. I mean, for how long are we going to deal with this with you? What needs to happen to support the police officers who are dealing with this frustration, so that in the system, then the police officer's burden is reduced?
The quality of investigations, because that is what determines whether someone is the prosecution actually gets a verdict or not, a guilty verdict or not. So if the criminal investigations are shoddy, then it will not. That's why I go back to the coroners. Who's collecting this forensic evidence? So you'll get a file that is not making sense.
Yeah.
So you'll take it to court, it will be dismissed, we are back again. So it's the quality of investigations that we are conducting.
So in addition to National Coroner Service, what else? And I completely hear you when you say that. It's the quality of our investigations. What else do we need to see so that when a case is being presented to the DPP, that case is rock solid?
I'd say, as well as the human resource, the police are overstretched. And so you'll find how many cases can they investigate adequately when they're very overstretched. So we also need to, back to the welfare, to ensure that we have adequate police officers according to the international recommended standards that we have. In 2007 and 2008 general elections, they said that there was no way we could contain what was happening given our
numbers.
There was no way. And you understand, because that's the honest truth. And so we need to ensure that the National Police Service is adequately resourced. Secondly, is that they have a benign budget. And so you'll call them and I don't have money for fuel. And that's the truth.
Yeah.
Because as of the Inspector General is not the holder of the police budget. It's still held at the ministry level. And so he cannot even be able to properly,
He can't budget.
Exactly.
Because he doesn't even know how much money.
It's like someone else budgeting for your house.
Right.
So you'll find that the resources that they're working with are not up to standard. They even recently just reviewed the P3 form. Even a P3 form, for example, you need to go to a cyber cafe, print it, come with it to the police station, then go with it to the clinician to fill it.
Yeah.
So then, it brings you back to the question then that who is to be held responsible? Because if we're saying that we're taking this battle to the doorstep of the National Police Service, whose hands are tied, regardless of what you're looking at, there's competition for funding from the national level. The government will tell you, well, look, here are so many things that we have to do. Are we going to then apply more in terms of budget to this because we've seen that, yes, something needs to be done about it? Or are we going to now put everybody on a list and say, well, let's just chip off as much as we can? At whose door does this responsibility rest, really? Because we're basically saying here that, the NPS doesn't have as much power as it ought to, because clearly they don't control their own budget. If they're willing to do certain things in a certain way, again, they're powerless because they don't pull the strings of the purse. So whose doorstep really ought this fight to be taken to?
I'd say the president. It's the goodwill of the political ambit at the time. That's where everything lies.
It goes to the very top.
Yes.
The head of government.
Yes. Because you see, it involves the Treasury, it involves the Ministry of Interior, it involves so many departments. And who oversees them? Who oversees the cabinet secretaries at the end of the day?
It's also been stated at times, you know how rumors percolate in this country, that the government or the police service even sets up specific squads whose job is to eliminate people. given what you do, is this just a rumor? And should we continue treating it as a rumor, or is there some truth to it?
Are there death squads in the police
Should we not
service?
talk about it?
I have personally not engaged with them, but I have heard from witnesses who have stated that in Dandora, Mathare, there's a killer squad of police. Yes, and people ask me, why are they not held accountable? Because everybody is scared. I will know, but I want to save my life. So I'll come and share it here. Then when a person comes to do the investigations, I don't want to speak because I don't want to go.
You also don't want to disappear.
Exactly.
So even as IMLU, it's the same kind of thing. I mean, if all this time IMLU and the other civil society organizations dealing with the security sector have heard and come across this information of killer squads within the police service, and none of them has ever actually come out and said, indeed, these are the officers involved, or this is how the killer squads have been operating. Is this for that same fear?
No, you see, as we work with case files, so facts.
Okay.
So I will be told, but no one will be willing to give me a statement.
Okay.
So if it's not documented, it remains a rumor.
But are you not able to investigate and say, okay, what I have is a string of events that are pointing me to a certain direction? For example, a certain disappearance, a certain death, another disappearance end up in death. Witness testimonies.
Identifying a particular character
identifying.
over and over again.
There's a certain character who looks this way, and this same person was quoted by somebody else in Mandera, somebody else in, then you can come up and say, you know what, we do not know the identities, but there clearly is a killer squad that has been established.
No, that has been raised even before the Senate. There's a whole report the Senate released last year. That has been raised.
But
yeah,
You know,
not much traction has been done. The rumor is that there's political. It has a political aspect to it, and so not much has been done. But even the same has been raised with IPOA, because even as IMLU, we know we can only go so far as well. Because technically we are not trained investigators, but the IPOA is. And at the end of the day, we only go to court for civil matters. They go for criminal liability, which is much more important.
You know what is also strange is that when you look at folklore, the sort of like stories or the myths that go around regarding either these groups or these individuals, you'll find they even have community support. I remember the time when I worked in Kisumu County. I used to hear from people in some of the lower rent settlements that there was a police officer. They even gave him a name. They called him Wanyama. He said, when this man was here, these criminals disappeared. Then they transferred him. So they don't, apparently, again, within folklore, a delegation went to the provincial police officer and said, look, bring this person back. You transfer this person, we are having problems. When this person was here, we were safe. In the 1970s, there's a gentleman called Patrick Shaw. Okay? A huge 6 foot something plus 300-pound gentleman who was a police reservist, but who was known to do precisely this. The thing that Eric was talking about, folklore had it that he would warn criminals. He'd go to their families and tell them, your child is A, B, C, D. Either they change or they disappear, or they will disappear. So he had a raft of informers, from sex workers to kiosk owners, meaning he was well informed. Now, what am I saying? I'm saying this culture of people who seem to deal with supposed criminal elements outside the known boundaries of the law have existed, and they have continued to thrive because the communities support them. So it isn't. The only problem now is when the disappearances are attributed to them under very unclear circumstances, and you're not even sure whether the people they're dealing with who has disappeared are actually thugs, or whether they are some people whom some individuals don't particularly like, some political opponent, somebody who is human writing too much and causing discomfort for people. So When that gray area becomes gray and it moves to a different side, then the problem arises. But if I look at the chronology of events around this folklore, they are not groups or they're not individuals whom the community shun. The community actually thinks that what they're doing is a good thing. My thinking.
Are there grounds for that? Because, well, you live in this same community. You see, there are times when people feel, you know what, it's better to take the law into our own hands and deal with this issue once and for all. And when it's a police officer who's dealing with it, then you're like, they support that. Are there grounds for that? And is there a way in which we can actually have those two coexisting?
Yes, so it's both. It's both. So you'll find that they will go for people besides criminals. And I've done those cases. So those ones are the ones that come to us.
Yeah.
There are those that the community has already, you're a criminal, you've been raping our women.
Yeah.
And we take you to court. The justice system is clearly not working for us, or it will take you 10 years to, you come back to the community,
Yep.
you repeat the same thing. So we support the work that they're doing, which is also another thing that has been happening. So it's two-pronged. Yes.
If you were to project into the future and say, this is what the hope would be in the coming years and how we would hope the situation would change, with all the things that you have been seeing happening in the past and presently as contributing factors to the situation, what would you hope would be the case? What are indicators of how things may change? Are we looking at a maintenance of status quo, even looking forward?
No. I hope that, one, that there is a complete culture change within the National Police Service. We stopped calling it a force, but we changed the name, but not the culture. And so for me, I hope we can really change that culture and have a system where the community and the police can work hand in hand to eradicate crime and maintain law and order. I also hope that in case that does happen, we have efficient and effective accountability mechanisms. And so one of the things that creates a culture of extrajudicial killings is that people are not held accountable. And so I can do it and do it and do it and do it without me facing the law. And so if we're able to create accountability mechanisms, I think those two would be how we end up having a society where we don't a life is not lost through a gun.
Create or support, because we already have accountability mechanisms. There's an independent policing oversight authority. The police themselves have an internal affairs unit. So those exist.
There's some that need to be created, like the National Coroner
Like the
Service.
okay.
And there's some that need to be supported.
Okay.
Yes.
Kevin, we thank you very much for joining us today and for sharing with us all the knowledge that you have on matters of enforced disappearance and extrajudicial killings. Kevin Mwangi is a program officer with the Independent Medical Legal Unit, that's IMLU. It's a non-governmental organization that deals with human rights and especially looking at the justice system and the security sector, right? Have I given a good summary of what you guys do?
Yes.
Thank you very much.